We need to evaluate site access and local resources and requirements for the project. We need to write down what we saw in an orderly fashion. And we need to make sure we attend the pre-bid conference and any owner-conducted site tours. Okay. That's too far there. Back up one. No, you were in the right place. Go back to screen 15. There we go. So under preparation for site visit, we're going to study the plans and specifications. We're going to work up a preliminary construction plan, identify the approximate significant work, make some tentative decisions on some subcontractors, understand what the local material supplies are. We need to determine some equipment requirements. We need to investigate any legal and financial problems. And we need to start writing our questions to be answered by the owner site rep. While we're preparing for the site visit, we need to identify local sources for weather data, collect some maps and charts of the area, maybe do some research on the tax law and local labor regulations, laws, and rates. We'll need to identify available transportation. We might do some research to pull together some geophysical information. For instance, there's some standard soils reports that the U.S. government did a long time ago, basically for every county in the United States. It's a real good reference for types of earthwork you might encounter. And you also need to consider contacting the area's contractors, suppliers, material men, insurance providers, that type of thing. Next. This is an example, there's multiple pages in the handout, of a report that you might develop to standardize your reporting for your site visits. Next. Okay, I guess I'm still back. Go ahead to back to, please, Kenyatta. Okay, during the site visit, we're going to want to take pictures that we want the photographs to have time and date and location stamps on them. That's easy to do with today's technology. You might want to take a video record with audio documentation. Talk while you shoot. You want to consider ground surfaces and the potential conditions at different times of the year, other than at the time of the site visit. You need to kind of evaluate what your clearing and grubbing considerations are going to be. You need to be identifying utility locations and size and the availability of water and electricity. And you may need to be evaluating some preliminary layout for any temporary works, plant, or camp that you may need in support of the project. As far as site access and local details, how do you get to and from the work site? Is there sufficient labor, or you're going to have to bring labor with you? What's the sources of material? Especially with your large volume of things, where you get aggregate of the various types, where you get your earthwork. Where's the ready mix guy? How close is he to the project? Those kinds of things. You're going to need to look at what types of equipment you're going to need and how that's going to perform at the site. You need to find your local subcontractors, services, and support people. You may need to pull up some of the government regulations while you're in the vicinity. And of course, you're going to be looking at competition while you're in the area. The compose a site report, that's that sample report that keeps popping up, which is the next slide. And you're going to be going to some projects will have a pre-bid conference. That may be required. If it's required, make very certain you sign whatever attendance roster it is that gets circulated there. Next. Okay, planning the construction method. We need to figure out the way the project is to be executed, the sequence of the work, the types of equipment we'll need, any temporary works that we'll need, construction yard, storage area, lay down area, how we're going to plan and organize our day-to-day operations. And we're going to develop the plan for the operation. It needs to be straightforward and simple. The specifications may dictate parts of that plan of operation. You'll need to consider more than one method and sequence of the work. You're going to be needing to evaluate different potential risks. You need to consider how the seasons of the year will affect the project. You're going to need to coordinate your own forces and those of the various subcontractors. All of this has to be done with consideration for the time allowed for the construction by the contract. These things may affect the type of equipment and the size of the plant you select for the project. And of course, that's a function of what company you might already own, what are the work conditions, and what are the time constraints for the work. Your plan is going to need to consider your labor force as far as their skills and knowledge of the personnel. And you're also going to probably want to do some comparative studies. And in those, you're going to evaluate several different approaches. You're going to compare the cost of production for the different types of equipment to do each possibility. If the quantity varies depending on how you're going to do an alternate, you need to base it on that appropriate volume of quantity. You need to consider the cost of alternative materials. And then finally, you're going to compare the estimates of each of these methods to determine the ones that is most cost effective that meets the other requirements of your plan. Okay. This is an example of one of those comparative cost calculations. It involves a dredge crane, which is the clamshell, and it's two sizes. One's a 3.5 yard bucket and the other one's a 5 yard bucket. And the rent on the larger cranes, half again what it is for the smaller unit. And the operating rate for the larger equipment adds another 10% over the smaller piece. But the bigger piece does the work faster. So here, the expensive one's the better one. You'll notice it's $200,000 savings on $1 million once all the math is worked through. And that's basically not back of the envelope type of calculation. You do that several different alternatives for major features of your work as you're developing your plan. Next. So preparing the construction schedule. All time-related costs are to be determined in accordance with the schedule. The construction method that you've selected in our previous section is going to form the basis for your schedule logic, how the various parts of the work come together in sequence. Your estimating team should determine the time required to perform the work consistent with the minimum cost. The next 2 points you're going to develop are essentially, you're going to develop the preliminary schedule logic in conjunction with developing the preliminary schedule time. Logic is the sequence, time is how long the individual parts of the work are. They work together in a construction schedule. And you may also have to do some special schedules. In developing the preliminary schedule logic, your bid documents may dictate that certain items have to be completed before others. Your project schedule's start is going to probably be dictated by the award of the contract or perhaps a notice to proceed. And that's the more common one in DOTD world. The completion date and the number of days may be either working type days or calendar type days. In Louisiana, we account for adverse weather days, and your specifications may help you. You need to identify milestones that are interim required completion dates that may be stipulated in the contract by the owner. The more of these interim required dates that are present in the contract, it creates more risk for you to meet each and every one of those time requirements. And in doing your schedule, you need to also consider the availability of materials. Are you going to be able to get asphalt in the winter? And you get aggregate in the spring when floods are happening on the river? Those types of things. You need to consider the procurement of key items, especially your long lead time items. You need to allow time for the inspection and testing of various parts of the work. You need to allow time for the submittals and shop drawings. There may be an assembly period, a mobilization period. Sometimes there's very certain preparatory type of work that's allowed to be done during the mobilization period. Your schedule needs to consider weather restrictions and hazardous work items. Your schedule may need adjustment for limited access to and from the job site. That's especially critical in situations like airports, where getting in and out of that gate's very controlled. Your equipment requirements may require to do you may have significant effect on how your schedule comes together. Ideally, you want to do the work sequentially, one part of the work following right behind the other. But you may need to consider the cost to demobilize, remobilize a piece of equipment versus the cost of leaving it idle on the job site. As we develop the preliminary schedule time components, we're going to look at the activity durations, the time to do review of submittals, the time to review samples, taken test samples. How long are these long lead items for material or equipment? Is time available in the contract to do the project with the interim completion dates, if any? How does the timing affect your weather sensitive activities? How does your schedule affect your labor needs and availability? If you're having to do the schedule very quickly, you might have to be using more people or more overtime. Are you able to get the labor to do that? You need to know that or determine that as you're preparing your estimate. You need to determine how long your subs take to become available and perform. Different types of material can affect the duration, how long a given activity takes. Equipment, the size of it, the type of it, those things may affect the time of an activity. Remember, we've got to quantify some time for the inspection process. And we also kind of need to consider our cash flow. How fast or how slow we prosecute the work can affect the amount of cash you have on hand. Some of the special schedules we might look at. One would be a labor loaded schedule, which is ideally you want to develop your labor resources slowly and build up to in the middle of the project and then slowly ramp those down. Your first look at a schedule with the labor loading on there may indicate you need to change to adjust your schedule to improve the ramping up and down of labor. Your equipment loaded schedules are important because in preparing our estimate, we're going to have to recover in our bid price the cost of having equipment on hand while it is not being used, in addition to the time it is being used. And there's, as I mentioned earlier, that can affect cash flow for the project. Next. So we're now at a third of the big 6 bullets, dealing with our quantity survey. We're going to cover the purpose of evaluating the cost and time of a project. We must include all the material and items of work required for the project. This includes the temporary work on top of the permanent materials required for the work. We're going to have to do this, need to do this prior to the start of the survey, the site visit, at least a large part of it. And we need to be using complete documents, including all the addenda and those things. The purpose of doing the quantity survey is because we're evaluating the cost and time it will take to do a project. We must include all the materials and items of work required, including all temporary and permanent materials required to construct the work. Prior to the start of the survey, we're going to have to review the instructions to bidders in the contract, the technical specifications, the general and the special conditions, and the proposal form that will, because all of those will affect the way in which the work must be done in your takeoff and how you assemble your bid. You're going to review the following: a breakdown of the price. You're going to look at alternative prices. You need to determine whether pay items are unit price or lump sum. You're going to need to develop a bill of materials as you do your takeoff. There's some special rules of measurement for payment of certain items that may be different than the way you would want or think about as provided in the contract. There may be special descriptions of the scope of an item of work within the bid. And some bid items may have a firm quantity, which makes it kind of similar to a lump sum. The quantity survey needs to be based on complete documents. You want to use one set of bid documents for a control set as you're doing your estimate. And you'll want to develop a coding system so you'll know what part of the project's work has been taken off, the quantities have been pulled off in support of the estimate. You'll want to check that all addenda are included in this control set. And you'll want to review the bid form for the specific breakdown of the prices, the way you're going to have to pull together, do your takeoff to pull together your bid pricing. Okay. Principles of quantity surveying. The bid quantities in the contract are provided by the architect engineer for unit price contracts. don't rely on those quantities for purchasing of your material or costing of the work. By that, if the bid form tells you there's 10,000 yards of cut and fill to do, the numbers you're actually going to have to handle are going to be larger than those because of shrink and swell of the material. So the number of truckloads you're going to have to do is going to be a bigger number based on a quantity larger than the 10,000 in the bid quantity. So your bid form quantities are there for determining the low price bid and for determining how to pay the contractor. Those aren't quite consistent with you as the estimator putting together a hard money bid. Next. The construction method has to have the quantities to be included for what material you're going to be having to procure. And this includes the permanent material that shows up in the plans and also the temporary materials that it takes to put the permanent materials in its proper place. You might have a temporary road you had to build, and it required stone to be able to do that. You got to have the money in there to buy that stone to get the road in, and also to remove the stone once the road has served its purpose. You're going to have the right amount of labor in your bid for installing the materials. You're going to have to cover your construction equipment costs, and you're going to have to cover in your estimate the services of others, subcontractors, engineers, suppliers, and those things. When you're listing an item of work in your estimate, you're going to want to list it on two lines. And one's going to be based on the cost as you've determined in your estimate. And the other line is going to include the amount that you're going to have to buy in a list to help you purchase things when you're a successful bidder. Makes it easy to find it later. And we're going to have to identify our indirect costs after we've identified all of our direct costs. The direct costs are going to have a big impact on time, and indirect costs tend to be very sensitive, tend to be time driven. And also the way you may approach doing the direct work may dictate the amount of support, additional cost, indirect cost it takes to be able to do that. One approach may be require that you set up a yard on site, that another approach would not need you to put and to provide the indirect cost for that yard. Whereas another approach, just-in-time delivery method, for instance, would not need that storage yard to be developed or priced. Next. There's some rules of measurement as we're pulling together that we need to consider as we're pulling together our estimate. So we want to use our actual quantities versus the measured quantities. The actuals are the ones that we determine. They must be based on how the work's going to be executed using the assumed construction methods. An example of that is the standard specifications for DOTD projects say they'll pay for the excavation for a footing and that's equal to the size of the footing plus 2 foot around the footing. Whereas your work approach might be to if the hole is more than 5 foot deep, now you've got OSHA considerations, you're going to have to sheet the hole. So you're probably going to say, I don't really want the expense of putting sheet pile in for this deep hole. And an alternative, if there's enough room, you can over dig the hole, dig a larger quantity of work to eliminate the safety problem, to get the footing in place and then put that excess material back in its place. So that's what we're doing, two methods of calculation. We're going to do one the way we're going to do the work, and the other translates the cost of that into the rules of how that footing is going to be measured for payment when you're prosecuting the work. Okay. Some of the mechanics as we're quantifying the quantities in our takeoff. We're going to want to convert everything to decimal numbers, get the fractions into decimals. And you want to quantify your estimate the same way you're going to maintain these costs in through your successful projects and your historical data. You want to measure quantities by zones to help you do an orderly takeoff. By zones, in highway lingo, you're going to use stations, maybe mile markers. In buildings, it might be floors, those types of things. You want to make it easier by using regular, consistent methods for checking by yourself and checking by others. And you're doing this takeoff at the time of your estimate so that on the successful project, you can use these quantities to establish control budgets for the easier monitoring of your construction progress. And these quantities may also prove helpful as you're pulling together a CPM schedule, which is very detailed. Okay. As you're doing your takeoffs, you have to quantify things to industrial standards. In other words, you must allow for actual materials based on the industry, including material losses, because it's going to be consumed anyway. Remember, your plywood comes in standard 4x8 sheets. All your pipe comes in standard units. Your drainage pipe, your piping comes in double random, and that means it could be anywhere from 18 to 22 feet long. They're not all 20 feet long pieces. You need to consider waste factors. You want to mix up, let's say we're going to have a two-part epoxy, and you mix up the two components. You only have so long to use that epoxy. Well, if you only needed half the gallon, you're going to end up having to waste the other gallon. So you need to put those waste factors in your estimate. And you have to quantify for shrinking or swelling of the work. A classic example is earthwork. It's in the ground at one size. If you dig it out of the ground, it swells much larger. And then when you go to use it in a hole, it compacts in place smaller than the hole it originally came out of. So you have to track and price the volume of, it's the same dirt, but it's different volumes at different parts of the process. And you have to use the appropriate quantity for the pricing of each part of that process. Okay. On the accuracy of quantities, we need to use consistent methods to calculate our quantities. We need to use, I'll provide a caution against scaling dimensions when there are other ways to determine the size of. I'll provide some suggestions for maintaining satisfactory and consistent accuracy. And then we'll have a discussion of posting the quantities to the cost extension sheets. For the calculation of You go back. For the calculation of quantities, we're going to need a brief description of what the pay item is and where it's located. We're going to have to write down our dimensions, and we're going to list the length, the width, and the depth in the same order every time. We want to write enough description for positive identification, but we need to learn and use standard abbreviations and symbols. We need to remember to make all figures legible and stay within our column lines. We need to identify each sheet of our estimate with the project name, the date, who did the work, and who checked the work. We need to identify where the information came from by what sheet number, what section number, what detail on the plans. We need to clearly identify the total for any number that's going to be posted to our costing sheet. We're going to end up, you write a lot of numbers as you're calculating your quantities. When you get to that, the answer that you're going to carry to the costing sheet, probably want to circle that number. You're going to want to adopt standard code and marking systems so that the items can be checked by you and others. When you're scaling dimensions, you never want to scale if dimensions are readily available. Before you use the scale on a detail, you need to make sure that that picture is drawn to scale and it's not just a schematic. Beware of that abbreviation NTS, not to scale. When you're scaling, you want to use the dimensions for the smallest dimensions and multiply it, because you'll get the error in a larger dimension could be less significant. Some suggestions for maintaining accuracy. You want to be able to convert fractions to decimals readily. 3/4 is 0.75, half 0.5. Get comfortable using those decimals. It's generally faster and more accurate to convert the fractions to decimals as you're first writing it down on your quantity takeoff sheets. It's seldom necessary to be more accurate in your dimensions than 1/8 inch. And you can also remember that 1/8 inch is approximately 100.01 of a foot. So if you can get those conversions done as you're writing numbers down initially, the whole process will go quicker. When you're doing mass earth calculations, 1/10 of a foot may be close enough, especially if the final grading is specified to be within 1/10 of a foot accuracy. Your high cost items need more accuracy than the low cost items. And you need to remember industry standards when you're taking off the quantities. When you're posting quantities to the cost extension sheets, you don't need to transfer more than 3 significant figures for the quantity. For example, that calculated number 272,727 can be quickly written as 273,000. Next. The prevention of mistakes. We're going to talk about some avoiding common mistakes, some things we can do to self-check our work and to do our work so that it can be easily checked by others. And we're going to discuss some errors, some additional types of errors to look out for. Some common mistakes include an item that's missed entirely, an item that's doubled up, a decimal place that's placed in the wrong place, totaling numbers without a tape, using a calculator that doesn't have a recording tape, or these days, not doing it in a spreadsheet. Transposing a number as you're handwriting them on the page or typing them in. Or you might make a correction to a number in one location, but forget to go and get it corrected at its original source. Doing things in a consistent manner clearly helps you check your own work. You'll learn over time to kind of be able to get the right answer in your head as you're calculating the number. At least ballpark, you'll know it's about the right size number. That'll become helpful as an estimator. For checking by others, you're going to want to use standardized sheets for quantification sheets, for cost sheets. You'll want to identify a lead estimator to check over your work. They tend to develop enough experience and are able to provide some reasonableness. Is that number right? He can look at it and say, oh, no. It comes from experience. When you're checking by others, they're looking for mechanical mistakes before you carry the calculation into the next document. If you've got a large bid, you're going to want to pull everything together ahead of time, like a whole day, the night before, perhaps, to be able to ensure that your bid's in good shape. You'll want to recheck that all your plug numbers, plug number, that's a number that you've written in early in your estimating process when you didn't have a, that you know roughly what it's going to cost, and it's a place saver to get an amount of money in your estimate as you're waiting for that supplier, that subcontractor to provide you the particular number for this project. You're going to want to make sure that you've got all your postings done. You're going to want to try to make a copy of your recap sheet at the end of the night. You're going to want to check that recap sheet again. Well, the day of bid, or as you get closer to time of bid, you'll probably start getting those last minute quotations in. The subcontractors will be adding or cutting their price. You've got to deal with making those changes in an orderly fashion so that they get done, not duplicated, and the math's done correctly. And you're going to check that again about 2 hours before bid time. And you're going to check it again a half hour before bid time. Some other errors to check for. You're going to check that all numbers were properly transferred. You're going to check the scope of work. Is your written estimate consistent with what you thought of the work as you began to do your takeoff? You're going to be looking for math mistakes. Again, don't rely on your calculator without a tape. Don't rely on the calculator without your thought process saying, is the result reasonable or not? If you're adding 3 or more numbers, get that calculator with tape or else the spreadsheet. You're going to want to set up your cost sheet with columns so a check can be made both vertically and horizontally. That'll be important on your recap sheet. You'll want to use somebody with numerical skills to check the multiplications. You'll need to find someone that's familiar with the type of work to look at the estimate to see if it looks right. You'll want to photocopy each sheet after each check and note the date and time of the check. And as you get to the end of the process, you'll want to check your estimate sheets against earlier photocopy sheets. Just confirm that your papers are remaining in good order. Okay. Now we're to making the quantity survey. We've got to get organized. We've got to keep track of what has been measured. We've got to be working with our quantity sheets, and we need to keep it all organized as we proceed to the work of our takeoff. For example, next slide. Make standardized forms so that for use on each and every one of your estimates to help with the consistency. Do your quantity work, takeoff work on the quantity sheet. Those answers get carried into the cost extension sheet where some additional costing gets done. And the bottom line on the cost extension sheet for a given pay item gets carried to a recap sheet. Next slide. So in getting organized, we want to perform things in a consistent order. I recommend following the sequence of construction. You want to keep detailed notes of conflicts, errors, omissions, or questions you may have. You want to write down all your assumptions as you proceed. You want to read the technical specifications, the standard specs, and the plans. If you find a discrepancy in the plans, generally the larger scale detail is going to take precedence over the smaller scale. To keep track of what's been measured, you're going to want to mark the plans, highlighter, color pencil, those kinds of things. You want to establish a coding structure so that you'll know what has been taken off. Again, you'll generally want to take off the items in the sequence of construction. Your quantity sheets, you're going to want to list dimensions and calculations of quantities on those forms. The items to be considered for consistency include identify the source of each entry by its drawing, plan sheet, section of the specs, etc. Learn and use standard abbreviations in your descriptions. List the number of items and dimensions in the same order for every entry. And list all dimensions in a consistent format, meaning stick with feet and inches or else convert everything to feet with decimal numbers. And you'll want to identify the final quantity to be posted on subsequent sheets in a distinctive way. Circle it, underline it, with a red check, that kind of thing. Speaking of quantity sheets, if you're looking at a set of plans for a DOTD job, pay attention, always look for sheet 3, 3A, 3B, 3C. You'll find a very orderly quantity takeoff in much greater detail than the bid tabulations in almost every project. It'll be a big help for you as you're doing your own takeoffs to check those numbers. In organizing for the work of the kind of quantity survey, you want to prepare a separate recap sheet for each bid item. You're going to want to maintain the recap draft sheet, the initial sheet. You got to anticipate having to split the bids from various subcontractors. You need to break out their quote into the various bid items that it may apply to. And in your estimate, you'll want to have your unit price structure start with the breakdown provided in the contract documents. In quantifying the subcontractor's work, I recommend that you quantify the subcontractor's work, even though he's going to give that to you later. And some of the reasons for that is you may recognize when their quote is out of line. It helps you check that the subcontractor's proposal covers everything. It may help you understand some of the special problems encountered by the specialty subcontractor. It helps you evaluate the time allowed and required for the subcontractor's work. It may help you develop a price to cover a scope of work that is not present in the subcontractor's quote. And when time gets critical towards the time of, as the bid's getting closer, you may need to take advantage of having that number already calculated. It may help you, you may have, over time, you may develop have received quotations for this type of work from subs before. So you'll have a historical price to help build your judgment from. It'll give you a better understanding of the overall project, and it'll help you understand the timing in your schedule, and it'll help you better understand each quotation from the various subcontractors. A few words about outside quantification services, people that want to help you do the takeoff, help you do the estimate. You need to be very cautious in who you would use and very careful and try to avoid, honestly, the use of such services. They should have experience bidding the specific type of construction you're looking at, and they have to have knowledge of the sequence of work that you plan to use for the work. These outside quantity surveyors almost never assume responsibility for their own mistakes. Okay. Now, so far, we've talked about the upper left of this chart. We've talked about the quantity sheet. We've talked about the cost extension sheet just inside the dotted line. And we've talked about the recap sheet, which is basically that total direct cost box you see. And that's going to be available for each bid item. Left to do today, we're going to have to cover our indirect cost, which gets us to that total cost box in about the middle of the page. And then we're going to have to talk about overhead and profit to get to our balanced bid price, which is the bottom of the sheet, about a third of the way from the right. And then we've got to go through a finalization process, which is the right edge of the chart. Next. So now we're to the fourth of our 6 big bullets, talking about the cost of work. There's 2 main cost categories that we use to talk about in our estimates. That's direct cost versus indirect cost. And direct costs are usually pretty easy to see in the plans. And we've got to address all elements of costs associated with the specific work to be put in place. And then a unit price, the total can vary with the quantity actually done. The indirect costs are all elements of cost other than those we just discussed under direct cost. These tend to vary with time, and they need to be determined after the direct cost of work is determined. The elements of cost include labor, material, construction equipment, subcontractors, and services of others, and others which could be supply. Okay. In this chart on the left, we see we have our direct cost and our indirect costs. And across the top of the chart, we have our elements of costs. The significance of this exhibit is all the elements or costs are under both sections of cost, our direct and our indirect costs. Okay. In determining the cost, we've got to look at labor and burden costs, our material costs, our construction equipment costs, our subcontractors, our outside services and supplies. And then we've got to convert that into the unit cost for the work. And we're going to also need to compute some check numbers, the cost per hour, the cost of estimated production, how fast we're going. Under labor burden and costs, that's a function of how the work's going to be done. What's the scope of the work to be done? Kind of by that, I mean, is it a little bit of digging, which says we're going to use a shovel, or is it a lot of digging to do, which means we're going to use a backhoe? Who's going to be doing the work? What trades are involved? What level of skill are we going to need for the particulars of the work? And then how long is it going to take for the crew to execute this particular work as we're proceeding through our estimate? For material costs, we're looking at unit prices versus lump sum. We need to make sure that we include all of our sales tax, our delivery costs, the cost for any required warranties, the cost for patent rights, the cost for storage, those types of things. When we're looking at a construction equipment costs, we're going to differentiate between ownership costs, which is rent, so to speak, general loosely termed rent, and our operating costs, which is what it costs to run on top of the rent, to run the equipment in addition to what you're going to pay to rent it. We're going to have to deal with our subcontractor costs, our suppliers and services costs. And again, we're going to have to recast it into appropriate different ways of pricing. Okay. That last point, this screen's an example of some of the different ways that you're going to use your estimate to calculate different ratios, production rates. It helps with your thinking and your comparison and checking of your work. Okay. Direct labor and burden costs. We need to, for a given project, we need to look at the average prevailing cost per hour per person in each trade, including the labor burden costs. We need to evaluate the level of skills prevalent among the workers required for the project. We need to consider circumstances and conditions that exist during the time of our project. We need to evaluate what equipment we're using. We need to determine the productivity expected from specific crews. We'll need to know the cost per labor hour, the base wage and burdens. We'll cover various considerations, the use of historical data, and some factors that the contractor can and cannot control relative to labor. For direct labor and burden costs, Well, under the level of skills and the pay rates that you're evaluating, you need to be aware of a lot of jobs that have significant federal funds behind it. There may be a prescribed wage scale in the contract. And in certain venues, you may have to evaluate using union scale. Now let's focus on some of the considerations that relate to direct labor. What's the defined scope of work for each pay item? What are the details and specifications for the item and its cost data? What conditions and circumstances affect production for that work? How accurate was the accounting from the cost data, the historical data you might be referring to? The historical data, is it from recent production experiences? Has the historical production been modified due to different conditions, this project compared to that one? Some alternatives might not be similar enough, so you might need to use alternative sources. By that, there's some publications that provide some unit prices that I can find helpful from time to time. RS Means is one publisher that jumps to mind. Those especially help when when you're dealing with something that's a little beyond what your comfort zone is, or something outside of your direct experience. Some tips when using historical data: use it only from the specific projects, meaning don't use that averaged data. You want to use the data from the projects that have the most similar circumstances and conditions. You want to identify adverse factors on this project that make it different from the historical production, either higher or lower. And you want to make adjustments to come up with a baseline rate. You don't want to use one that's overly optimistic. You want to use the one you can count on as reliably, regularly achievable. Some factors that contractors can control: the quality of supervision, the skill of the labor, the types of tools and equipment you provide. So some things outside of the contractor's control: some details of the work, plans and specifications. How much repetition and quantity are required for the project? Again, plans and specs. Your weather conditions, to a large degree, site conditions, working conditions, and the quality of the owner documents. Okay. I provide this outline not because it's exactly accurate. It's decent for a reference. Basically, it's a direct labor across the top. And compare that to the number at the bottom after all the payroll taxes and fringe benefits and whatnot that contribute to the payroll burden amount to. The lesson here is payroll burden is very significant. Next. On our direct material costs, we have to cover permanent and material or temporary materials we'll use for the project. We need to evaluate the lump sum or the unit price basis for the material. We need to consider any reuse of the temporary materials. We need to look for any purchase discount and payment discounts from our suppliers. We need to determine a way to evaluate our suppliers and subcontractors' quotations. And we also need to find ways to find those quotations, to expedite those quotations, to go get the quote when they don't find you before, as you're pulling together your estimate. To drill down a little bit on determining the best supplier prices. Is the price they've given you responsive? Does it apply to what you really need to meet your contract? In determining the best price, you need to consider, does it meet the required specifications? Is the quote based on exactly the same materials required by the contract documents? Is the supplier able to deliver any shop drawings and submittal materials? Has the vendor acknowledged all addenda for the contract? Does the person providing the quote have proven financial and performance history? Does the quote include all delivery, sales, and sales tax costs? Does the quote warrant that its price is firm for some period of time? And does that written quotation provide any favorable terms? For example, early payment discounts and those kinds of things. Okay. In looking at construction equipment costs, we're going to look at the ownership cost versus the operating cost, and then we're going to determine the equipment cost for an estimate. Okay. Drilling down on the ownership costs, we have the depreciation, which most closely maps to the rent. If you own this particular piece of equipment and you're determining the ownership cost, you're also going to want to consider use of a replacement reserve. That means a certain amount of money that you set aside that as you put this piece of equipment on a job to get paid for by that particular project, to hold that money in reserve for the eventual purchase of a replacement piece of equipment. The cost of ownership needs to include the amount of money that it costs you, the cost of money, the amount of interest you paid in carrying the loan to buy the equipment. It needs to include the various insurances that you'll have to buy for accident, theft, and vandalism. You'll need to include the cost of storage, and one aspect of that is the rent, the notes you're having to pay on that piece of equipment when it's not even assigned to a project. That cost needs to be recovered somehow. In some states, that piece of equipment is going to have a personal property tax associated with it that needs to be built into the ownership cost. And of course, you got your licenses and your fees for that piece of equipment. And then you need to consider how you're going to do the accounting for your labor, parts, and repair. Some of your larger construction firms will set up their own equipment system yard. And that equipment system needs to be paid for by the ownership cost, the rent of your various pieces of equipment. Okay. Now looking at your operating costs, those are the ones that you incur only because the piece of equipment is in use. And that's your fuel, that's your oil and grease, your filters, your regular preventative maintenance, you're rotating the tires, and you're also going to have to develop a component of cost for the repairs of the equipment. Okay. When we're looking at our estimate, we need to determine the price of each piece of equipment and what it will be to the job. And by that, as long as that piece of equipment is on the job, it needs to get the ownership contribution for every single day that it's on the job, whether the piece of equipment's in use or not. And then your takeoff, you're going to be you need to track the use time for that equipment so that you can charge the operating costs correctly. So you're going to charge operating costs only when the equipment's used, but you're going to charge ownership costs whether you're using the equipment or not, as long as it's on the project. So you have to develop your unit costs in the form required, covering these equipment costs in the proper format for bringing it into your estimate. And it may require some adjustment for the details of a given pay item. Okay. Let's look at our subcontractor costs and what to think about when we're given a proposal. Is the quote complete for everything that goes with a type of work? In the vertical construction, it's called a division or subdivision of work. In DOTD world, you can kind of think of the standard specification numbers are kind of grouped into a division of work. Earthworks in the 200s, and you got the 300s, and you got your structural work in the 800s, and that kind of thing. Does the quote clearly define what is included in the scope of work in the quotation? Can the subcontractor provide qualified supervision and labor and sufficient labor to meet your project's requirement? Does the sub have the ability to deliver shop drawings and materials to the job on schedule? Has the subcontractor committed to your schedule? Has the subcontractor acknowledged all addenda in making the quotation to you? Does a subcontractor have a proven performance history? Does the quote he's providing meet all requirements of the specifications with no exceptions to the bid documents? Does the quotation include any performance and payment bonds? One note, since a lot of us are subcontractors, this might be a good list for us to review to improve on how we as subcontractors present to the various general contractors we encounter to improve our business. Next. Some additional direct services and other expenses to consider include water tap. What does it cost to have your certain sewer hooked up? In a building, you got your air balancing period towards the end of a mechanical, electrical setup. You may have inspection fees, especially if you're using outside services. You've got a cost for your various bonds and insurances that you'll have to provide. And you may end up having to use outside services such as engineering, surveyors, et cetera, in your project. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about our indirect costs. These are quite often determined by the time of the project, how long the project takes. Your indirect labor and burden costs will be, has to cover our project management, our supervisors, maybe our layout people. Larger projects, we may have an administrative group on the job site. Our indirect material costs might include that asphalt or concrete batch plant we had to set up, a temporary office we had to put in place, or one that we had to provide for the owner's representative. Perhaps our final cleaning is a separate operation. Our indirect equipment costs may include the installation of a temporary road. If we're bringing on a job site crane, it's got to cost to move it in and take it out. We may have some additional subcontractors to provide the temporary items, to build the fence, build the road, those kinds of things. We may have the outside engineering and surveyors and testing fees to pay. And we've got our various insurances and services and permits, fees and supplies, et cetera, to consider. Okay. Here's an even longer list of details to consider as we're looking at our indirect costs. Okay. Hang in there, folks. We're now at our 5th of the 6 big overview points. We're now to the finalizing and submitting of the bid estimate. We want to use good procedures to finalize the estimate. We want to handle our last minute quotes. We need to determine the final bid price, and we need to follow through on the submission of the bid. Some of our good procedures for finalizing the estimate or checking that estimate, and another form of checking that estimate called management reviews. How do we handle those last minute quotes? A lot of times, if you've got a lot of pay items on a given pay project, a contractor will close out, meaning finish all of his calculations, et cetera, on all the pay items except for the last one or two. The DOTD mobilization item is usually a good one for this. And that is the last number that gets finalized. So any of these, the last minute phone calls and the guy walking in the door, oh, whoa, I got a big cut in my price. You can accommodate that in a place that's manageable. In determining the bid price, we're going to do a final check of the recap. We're going to make sure we got all the ads and cut sheets accomplished. We're going to make a final assessment of risks. And then we're going to determine the markup. And usually that gets applied to the individual unit prices on the recap sheet. Finally, as we're getting ready to submit the bid, we're going to be checking the bid form. We're going to anticipate proper timely delivering of the bid. An infamous one I had in my life, the Corps of Engineers bid acceptance office in the New Orleans area is up by the river in New Orleans proper, across the railroad track. And it's a big deal for making sure you're on the right side of the track when bid time comes up. Make sure you have the appropriate bid security included with the bid. Sometimes that's a check in a certain amount. Sometimes it may be a bid bond. Occasionally, it may be the performance and payment bonds, though DOTD allows a period after the bid to deal with that in a timely fashion. Okay. So here's basically what I just covered under determining the bid price and submitting the bid. Okay. Here's finally got the 6 of 6, folks. Here's the post-bid follow-up and using our construction estimate. In the post-bid follow-up, we're going to include preparation of our budget because we were successful in our bid. And now we've got to transfer our knowledge as estimators to our project construction team. We're going to need to organize our estimating files for proper protection and keeping them together for later reference. And we may need to extract valuable information from it now to use in future estimates. So immediately after we turn in the bids, we're going to want to clean up the bid files, put them in good order. You're going to correct that recap form to make your final cuts and adds in their appropriate places. Yeah, you're going to sort the papers and tidy up the bid room. Okay. Our post-bid follow-up went low. There's a number of items that may be required shortly after. As I mentioned, performance and payment bonds executed by proper surety. Proof of the various insurance types. You may need to submit a detailed contract schedule. There's two versions used by DOTD, one of which is a construction progress schedule in the vernacular. It's a bar chart versus the critical path schedule at the bottom. You'll need to do a breakdown of your bid price for payment purposes, meaning you're going to kind of start stringing your prices out in time to start getting an idea of cash flow. You're going to develop a standard list of subs and suppliers to be able to talk to the other firms as you're doing the buyouts for your project. If you have a lump sum or a significant lump sum pay item in the project, you may need to start developing a schedule of values. It's fairly common in the vertical construction, which is basically a lot of things are taken as or bid as a lump sum, but shortly thereafter, the owner's representative is going to be asking for you to break down that lump sum price into parts, and the parts get paid incrementally through the various progress payments. Okay. Here's some thoughts to help you transition from your estimators to your construction team. Sometimes contractors will wait until just after the notice of award, which basically means, hey guys, the contract's coming, but you need to get that transition done before you get the work order, which is often that notice to proceed, that pre-construction meeting perhaps, basically time to go to work. You'll need to confirm the assumptions you made during the bid preparations regarding plan and schedule and get those concerns transferred from the estimators to the construction team. And you're going to need to help out the construction team with the time, given the time required for preparing the shop drawings, the time required for the delivery of the various types of materials, convey any special concerns that you as estimator have regarding an activity, provide the time required for doing each activity. And you want to communicate these specific methods that are used to prepare the estimate to help the construction team as they pull together their plan for the work. Okay. Now we're going to take the estimate and we're going to use it to establish a project control budget. And this is important because we're going to want to monitor the production costs, our labor use, our equipment use, our materials and our services as we do the work. We're going to want to monitor our progress payments to make sure we're getting paid accurately. And so that we can get our payments in order to distribute to our follow-on subcontractors and suppliers. And it helps us set up our labor budget so that we can aid project manager in planning the manpower needs, so that we can monitor production costs. We want to provide earnings forecasts, and we can use this information to help improve our labor production. Okay. Some things to do when we're not low. We want to follow up, see what information we can get to improve our work from our suppliers and subcontractors. We might look at our bid in detail to determine where in particular we were high or low for further investigation. And we may want to save some valuable information for use in subsequent bids. We'll want to use our estimate for procurement for the project, to schedule our use of resources for the project, and to get our submittals underway. Well, great. Okay. So in review, here's our big six. We've dealt with the decision to bid or no bid, and we've planned for how we're going to proceed with preparation of the estimate. We've identified some underlying studies we need to do. We've touched on how we're going to do the quantity survey and takeoff process. We talked about how we're going to do the costing of our work. And we talked about how we pull together the direct and the indirect costs and finalize those unit prices into our bid and prepare and finalize the bid for submittal. And we've also talked about what to do with the bid after the fact. Okay. Have you any questions?
Man, Daryl, great job, Daryl. You know, every time I get a chance to hear this, because obviously I'm always in attendance, it's just, you know, I get more and more information. And it just makes me that much more. I'm going to get my camera here. That much more informative for, you know, for the firms when they want the one-on-one assistance. Again, man, I applaud you, man. I applaud you on the information that you shared. I applaud you for being available each time that the firms need the one-on-one assistance. And I know you was giving a synopsis today. Hopefully what you provided this evening gives a solid foundation platform. Obviously, it could have been information that the attendees already are using. Hopefully, you gave them some additional things that they can begin to add to their estimates, because it is important to put together a quality estimate. However, it's also, I believe this is important to make sure that there is profitable at the end. You know, a lot of times when firms reach out to us for the one-on-one assistance, you know, they don't, some of them don't know where to start. Some of them don't know what to consider throughout. And we've had one of those just recently. A firm was reaching out that was interested in just trying to get an idea on, you know, how to put together their costs for trucking. And obviously, as always, when I call to lean on you for that information, there's always additional questions, because that cost, as we were able to tell tonight, has more to it just finding out what the, you know, going rates are right now. You know, it's a lot of factors involved in that. So again, man, anytime you have this opportunity, you do such a great job. So obviously I want to applaud you on that. So let me, I do see a few things in the chat and in the question and answer. I'm gonna go to the question and answer area first. It says larger firms could have lower overhead than SBEs and DBEs that may result in lower bid rate for employees in the same position. What do you suggest that a smaller firm could do to be competitive with labor costs considering this?
The real driver there is the lack of a volume, a significant number of projects to be able to contribute. Each project's going to contribute to the president's salary, for instance. In a small firm working one project has only so much it can pull from that one project for the president's salary. So another word of saying it, that one project has to pay the entire salary of the president. Versus a larger firm's got 5 projects all contributing some part of the president's salary. So more work helps. Cheaper presidents.
Mm-hmm.
Efficiency is knowing how to do the work better, so that the number of hours it takes to get that work done is a that might be the first thing you want to look at to try to attack. How can you deliver the same or better quality with less effort? By knowing how to do it better, quicker. Maybe buying the best tool, or knowing where, finding that easier, faster way of getting it done. Not an easy question.
Okay, how would you handle, this is another question there. How would you handle long lead items in your schedule?
The first thing is we need to write it down in that schedule. And we do that primarily, 1, to see the impact, but 2, not to forget it. We want to be reminded that it's there all along. Another way that you can deal with it, and this helps in any activity that takes a long time, you need to break it down into smaller pieces so that you can measure progress on that long lead time. Sometimes you can't really chop it into pieces, but you can at least put milestones, like, has this handoff happened between this part of the process and that part? Has the shop drawing been prepared? Has the shop drawing been submitted? Has it been approved? You're tracking all these piece parts to make sure you're staying on track so that you don't get a surprise with that long lead item being delayed. So set up and track milestones, make the calls to check on the progress at significant milestones, break it down into manageable pieces, find out how long it's supposed to be, and track that, write that date down, and then reach out more than once to ensure that you're on track to maintaining that schedule.
So I see.
Sometimes you may have to go find that thing from somewhere else. Sometimes you can't do that. But you can remember to see if you can't go somewhere else to get the same thing if the time is too long. Hopefully that helped a little.
Mm-hmm. I see someone posted this question in the chat, but it was early on in our during the webinar. They said, can you go over submittals a bit in this presentation? So I'm assuming you answered that throughout. Obviously, if there's anything, if there's anything more specific, the individual that asked that, please feel free to go ahead and type it in the chat or into the question and answer section. Obviously, we're doing good on time. We got a few more minutes. Again, I want to be very respectful of your time so we can stay on track. So we do have a few more minutes to answer some other questions. Again, that individual that was asking about submittals, I hope that throughout the presentation, because that was asked a little bit early on, I hope that Mr. Ivy was able to address those for you. Let's see.
Most of the DOTD submittals they're fairly rare as compared to some other industries. They are standard, meaning once you learn which ones are required for your type of work and you're staying with the DOTD as a client, then you pretty much know what your submittal is going to be regularly. There are a lot of people, there's a lot of assistance that can, if I knew what particular item of work you were talking about, a lot of people will help you get those requirements known in the DOTD side. It's going to be a completely different animal over in the vertical construction. That in buildings and whatnot, the submittal process is much, much more complex than your DOTD projects. So that if you're in that industry, you got a long list to go through.
Right. I'm gonna answer this one here. They was asking about the recording. It depends. Once we get all the editing done, we do our best to send to send it directly to the attendees. Because the question was asked, will it be sent to each of you all or to our site? If it's too long, then we'll just post it to our site. However, if you go to our site and subscribe to it, then you will get a notification letting you know that it's been populated. And again, I put that in the chat before, if you're listening, it's www.louisianadbe.com. Louisiana is spelled out. So again, that's www.louisianadbe.com. And then, so if you subscribe, you will get a notification letting you know that it's been populated. And then, obviously you can go in there, and what we typically do is have the recording. We will have the slides that Mr. Ivy was using today, as well as the handouts also. So you do have it, but I know over time, just in case if they get misplaced, they will be available there. And also you can contact myself or Ms. Grace Chapman, and either one of us will be able to get it to you. Let me go back to the question and answer. Hey, Daryl, while I'm doing that, though, I got a question for you also. How beneficial is it while they're preparing their bids, their estimates, is the bid tabulations that's available on the construction letting information page on DOTD site? How helpful is that as a tool for them to use also?
For those that do a lot of DOTD work consistently or regularly, that's a very strong tool. Basically on the website, DOTD puts all the bids it receives. It puts all the details, meaning all the pay items for each and every estimate get posted on their website. They're easy to find. So you can go look at the various projects for the pay items that you're interested in, and you can collect a historical bid price for that type of work for as long as you can pull. As long as you want to pull, you can pull more information. There's lots of good information there. It can be very helpful in getting a ballpark idea for what the work should be. There's a caution. You don't know you may or may not know the particulars of that project and how it fits with the one you're looking at in particular. But if you look at the website's posted bid tabulations for a number of jobs, and if you do this regularly, you get a sense for how your price is going to need to, where your price might need to be, at least a direction to move your thinking as you're developing your estimates. Are you steadily too high? By how much? Well, you can use the website to determine, well, I'm double everybody all the time. Well, that doesn't mean go cut your price in half. That means figure out a way to make your work cost less.
Right. So what I do for all firms, I provide a tutorial on how you can navigate to get to this site that I'm sharing on the screen right now. So anybody that wants to know, the tutorial typically lasts, we normally schedule anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. Obviously, I allot enough time for there to be questions. I kind of, navigate through it based off of the individual. But we typically 45 minutes to an hour. I give a full, and this all comes from the leader, Darryl, man. He shared with me on how to really utilize this page, this construction letting information page. And you can get so much information, if not all the information you need for these projects, that I always, offer this to make sure that everybody can stay proactive instead of reactive whenever they're preparing their bids, whenever they're, forecasting, as for the projects that they want to go after in the future. Because I know one of the things Darryl shared with me, if you're waiting until the advertisements come out, to determine which ones you may want to go after, you kind of a little bit behind as far as in your business development aspect of whom you may want to reach out to sub with, to the prime contractors, or whom you may want to reach out to if you're the prime and you may want to get some subs. Because there's an area on this site where you can actually forecast 12 months in advance. And I'll show you how to utilize that tool. But for the bid tabulations, I highlighted it right here. Obviously, all you have to do is click the drop down arrow and it'll pretty much share with you the, the lettings. So remember, the letting dates is obviously the date that the bids are due. Headquarters is typically the ones that you're going to see with the federal funding assisted projects that's going to have DBE or SB goals on them. Anytime you see the specific districts, a lot of times those are not federal funded projects and they're going to typically not have a goal on it. But I sent all this information out. But just on the last heading, I'm going to show you this. And then obviously, if we have any other questions, we'll address that and we'll be wrapping it up. But just kind of get an idea on what Darryl was saying. Once you click, hopefully, did my screen, do y'all see bid tabulations at the top?
Yes.
Okay, good. And I'm going to just do the first one. What it'll do is it'll show you who the lowest bidders were. And this list can be long. I've seen it go all the way up until maybe 10 or 11 of the firms. And then it takes it and it shows you both of the firms that are listed and it itemizes each one of the lists. And this is the reason why I know when I first began doing supportive services, Darryl, shared with me this screen, and it's been very useful for me and it's been useful for the firms that I've been had the pleasure of being able to give a tutorial. So I just wanted to let anyone that's on here this evening that really had never seen it before, at least your eyes can be accustomed to knowing what it looks like now. And you can see how they take the full list of items and they give an itemized list of what each prime contractor bidded on. Obviously, it doesn't tell you what they're subbing out. It doesn't give you their profit margin, but at least it does tell you what their bid is on it. So like Darryl say, you can kind of get a good idea of where you're at in your bid. So, obviously I wanted to make sure I brought that up because that's one of the tools that Darryl has always shared with me. And also to make sure that, he was telling you how when you use the construction proposal documents, you can really narrow it down to those. I think, what was it that you were saying? That was a B1 or C1 or C2. Those particular documents definitely break it down as far as the quantities and everything else. So let me check and make sure, see if you got any more questions in here, Mr. Darryl, Mr. Ivy. Okay, we good there. Let's see. No, that's it, man. We got all the questions answered. Obviously, everyone that's in attendance, I'm keep myself readily available.
I just posted one to Ms. Tanner's question.
And the question and answer.
Let's looking to see what I had here. The question was about the overhead rate and how does the smaller firm compete with a larger firm?
Oh yeah, that was the first one. I got you. That was the first one that we that you had addressed. So Darryl, before we
okay, go ahead, Kenyatta.
No, if you had something to say, I apologize. Go ahead.
The answer I typed up, basically there's 4 dimensions to any project and they're interrelated. So you increase one, you're gonna have to pull in on the others for the same project. And those 4 dimensions are cost, schedule, quality, and scope. In answer to what does the small firm do against the big firm, you've got to figure out what you can do using those 4 dimensions to be able to deal with that same project from a different perspective. That's it.
So Darryl, before we end everything, is there anything you would like to share with the audience?
Well, I really appreciate everybody taking the time and they're in actually having the interest, because I'm interested in this type of thing. And I wish them all safety in their pursuits.
Well, again, Darryl, obviously, we communicate a lot. So, but I definitely want to take this opportunity publicly to say again, thank you for the plethora of information that you have provided this evening, for what you continue to keep yourself available for whenever we lean on you for the one-on-one assistance. Folks, we always share with everyone, please take advantage of this free assistance that we provide all of the DBE firms. We're the consultants again for DOTD compliance programs. We did have Ms. Paula on this evening. I wanted to make sure I recognize that, what her and her team is doing is phenomenal things. They standing on the table for you all behind the scenes, making sure that they're, the main topics of agenda are being addressed whenever she has an opportunity to sit at the table with Secretary Wilson and any of the, anyone else, your state legislators, anyone from the governor's task force. Anyone that she has a listening ear, she's always standing on the table, making sure that she can do everything within her power to make this a successful program, which in turn also gives us the platform to be able to do what we're doing this evening. I want to make sure that I publicly let you all know that she was in attendance this evening. There are times where we're going to have webinars in the future where she will come on and give a synopsis of what the current status is for the program. She did a great job last December, ending the year, catapulting us into what we believe is a great point where we had at the 6-month point. We do have a webinar coming up on the 29th. I believe that's next Wednesday or Thursday, that we're going to be doing a mid-year review of where everyone is at as far as, with the program itself, with themselves, and let you all know what we have coming up in the future as far as our webinars. And Darryl will be doing another one in the future on planning and scheduling. And I hope that all that's in attendance and even can be there. So again, please lean on us, allow us to be able to assist you, give us an opportunity to help you continue to grow your business, to be successful and sustainable. As you can tell, Darryl is a plethora of knowledge. And we are we're the conduit to get you to him. So anytime, call, shoot us an email. We're more than ready and able to be able to assist you. And again, as Darryl stated, man, we appreciate you all for taking the time out this evening, which is scheduled, and hopefully, which we believe this was some great information for you to receive. Just feel free to give me a call, email, let me know what we need to do to help you all win. Again, thank you, and you all have a safe and blessed evening. Good night, you all. Thank you again.
Thanks, Kanata.